There is a difference between merely believing something and actually living it out. The church has struggled for years with the surrounding four walls of its building. In some cases, it has felt more like a holding cell than a launching pad. Join the Beyond the Building podcast as we strive to encourage the living, breathing church to influence the world in ways only seen in Scripture.
Welcome back to our Beyond the Building podcast. We're thankful that you're here with us. We have thoroughly enjoyed this study of the God that we thought we knew. So many facets of God, I think, have been introduced, and so many of you have messaged us or talked to us about the ways that, it's transformed the way that you've studied books like Genesis and even more in your own personal study, some of the other books. And that was exactly our goal, just to help us to see God in the way that He's revealed Himself to us through Scripture. If you'll remember, the last time we were together, we talked about Abraham and Lot from Genesis 13, and we specifically focused on how God was a restorer, how God brings us back to those places where we committed to Him, where we set ourselves aside or toward His goal, His purpose, and His calling. And sometimes we get away from that and we have these expectations about how God will react when we fail or when we mess up or when we kind of venture away from His way or will. But we saw how God helped Abram back to a position of commitment and focus. And that's the kind of God we want to continue our discussion on this morning, the God of restoration. Scott's going to lead us in a discussion of that from Genesis 18.
So I'm going to ask you guys, what's the first thing you think of when you hear Sodom and Gomorrah? Austin Johnson.
Pillar of salt, wickedness.
Okay. First thing you think of, Sodom and Gomorrah, Ty Rhymes.
Yeah, wickedness for sure comes to my mind.
Okay, so here's what I had always thought. Sodom and Gomorrah, evil, pure evil. Nothing good comes from Sodom and Gomorrah. It's all bad. It's all terrible.
Right.
The interesting thing I found is in Genesis chapter 18, right after God promises the birth of Isaac, and you have the laughing Sarah moment, when you get to verse 16 of chapter 18, then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." That's the word I want you to pay attention to. "So that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said this, and this was the part that jumped off the page to me. Because, like you guys, my first instinct on Sodom and Gomorrah is wickedness. Look at what God says in verse 20 and verse 21. "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether." Some translations say whether they deserve destruction, according to the outcry that has come to me. "And if not, I will know." The interesting thing I found there is we immediately go to what happens after this conversation, and we think, God, this entire time, He was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He was going to end the existence of these two towns. And yet, that's the God that we need Him to be, is the vengeful, throwing lightning bolts God. And instead, you get this point here where God says, I'm going to go down and check it for myself. Even though, does God know what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, sure He does.
Surely.
I mean, He says the outcry has reached Him. Mm-hmm. He knows exactly what's going on down there, but He still says, I'm going to go down and check it out for myself. Which means, was there an opportunity for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah to turn from their evil ways and be saved? Yes. Yes. Did they? No. We know that. But I found it interesting that God said, I'm going to go down and check this for myself. And if what they have done is as bad as I hear, I'll know. And then He has this conversation with Abraham. And Abraham knows who lives in Sodom at this point, which I found that interesting too. So if you go back to Genesis 13, where we were last week, Sodom is a place that Lot sets a tent towards. He's not there yet. He is basically outside the city, and he is sleeping and staying outside the city in Genesis 13. By the time we get to Genesis 18 in this conversation between God and Abraham, Abraham now knows for a fact that Lot and his family are in Sodom. Chapter 19 and verse 1 tells us he's sitting in the gate when the angels show up. So there's a lesson there, obviously, that when Lot picked the land that he picked, he put himself in a position to be tempted. Now, whether or not he did that on purpose, I'm not comfortable to say that. But we know from 2 Peter chapter 2 that when he moved into Sodom, he was tormented daily by the evil that was around him. Abraham knows that, and he knows the person that Lot is. So when God comes to Abraham and says he's going to destroy Sodom, Abraham says, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Now remember, the word I asked you to think about was the word justice, verse 19. That came out of God's own mouth. To keep that, he's challenged Abraham to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. So he goes to Abraham and says, this is what I'm going to do. And Abraham basically uses that in his conversation with God. Now, wait a minute, God, if you are a God of righteousness and justice, would you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? And then you get into the numbers, right? 50. The interesting thing I want you to pay attention to as we study this is verse 25 of chapter 18. Far be it from you to do such a thing. This is Abraham talking to God. Now, I want you to think about the conversations you've had with God, we've had with God, where we have challenged God's actions. We've said, well, God, you can't do that. Or God, you shouldn't do that. Or God, you ought to do. And remember that God is a God of righteousness and justice. And here's Abraham trying to implement his own beliefs on justice. Now, God, you can't really destroy a city if there's righteous people there. Verse 25, for far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Here's why I bring that up. Far be that from you, shall not the judge, capital J in my translation and probably most translations, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Now, that's an interesting challenge, I find, at least in my opinion. It's an interesting challenge by Abraham to God. Because if you go back to what we covered last week in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham lied. He was deceptive. He didn't trust God's plan for them going into Egypt. He tried to make his own plan. When that failed, God restored him. And yet here is Abraham saying, God, I'm just not sure you know what you're doing just yet. I mean, you can't destroy the righteous with the wicked. That wouldn't be fair. So God basically allows this conversation. I know people before have tried to make this into Abraham changed God's mind. I'm not sold on that at all. But whatever the case may be, verse 26, God says, okay, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous people, I'll spare the whole place. And we go down the numbers, right? But verse 27 is very important before we get into the numbers. Abraham has a wake-up call of sorts, a realization. And I think it goes back to what Ty said last week, that reminder that God provides him in Genesis 13 of remember the conversations we've had, remember who you are, and remember what we've done. Abraham answered verse 27 and says, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Okay, so then we go through the numbers, 45 to 40 to 30 to 20. Then finally we get to verse 32, for the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. The Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Now let me pause just for a second and ask you guys, does God know that there are less than 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah when he leaves the conversation?
Yep.
So why in the world would he then agree to this if he already knows there's less than 10? What's the point? Like, why would he not just tell Abraham, look, man,
There's nobody there.
there's nobody there.
Mm-hmm.
What's the point there? Because to me, that's a very interesting little interaction, because God knows through this entire conversation what is going to happen. There's not going to be a reprieve, because he knows there's not 10 righteous people. And even if he'd have gone to 5, would there have been 5 righteous people? No, there wasn't 5 righteous people.
No.
But for what reason does God look at Abraham and say, okay, for the sake of 10, I won't destroy it? What's the point?
Grace?
Yeah, I was thinking mercy,
Exactly.
like he allowed Abraham to intercede for the people, even though he knew, like you mentioned, that there was not that many people there, and God could have destroyed the city from the beginning, but it was like this mercy is seen, I think, most clearly in this one fact that he would have spared the city if there were that many people, and it seems like he's showing his grace and mercy to Abraham by allowing him to intercede for those people.
It's not a law. Had there been 10 righteous people in
He
Sodom
would
and
have
Gomorrah,
done
he
that.
would have
That's right.
relented.
That's true.
And I guess it's interesting that you brought up the initial thought of this city, and even the story overall, not just city, but the story, is wickedness, destruction, pain. But the God, and that's the God we thought we knew. Mm-hmm. Switching up our mindset becomes the God who provides a pathway for salvation, maybe even for reconciliation. The outcry against them is so bad. Let me go down and see if it's as bad as the outcry suggests. Was God suggesting in the silence of the scriptures? Is there something in there in the background that says he's open to people repenting, changing their ways? So, and then another thought I had was in Job 42. There's a really weird text that God is speaking to Eliphaz, the Temanite, I believe. Is he the Temanite? Yeah. And God says to him, go get 777 for sacrifices, because you've spoken wickedly and evil about me. Your friend Job has not. You go do that, because I've accepted Job, and go make that sacrifice, lest I punish you, lest I turn against you. So what he's saying is, I'm offering a path of reconciliation and salvation for you through my servant Job. And I'm kind of seeing a parallel here in Genesis 18. It's like, I'm offering a path of reconciliation through my servant Abraham if the hearts are willing to submit to it.
Well, and that's the fact of that is found in Genesis 19 and 29, because when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. So it's literally, Lot is saved, and Lot is, we know from 2 Peter chapter 2 that Lot is a righteous man. So let's get that on the table first of all. So there is one. We know there's one in Sodom and Gomorrah, because that's what Peter tells us in 2 Peter 2. But God knows there's not 10. But Lot is not just saved because he's a good person. He's saved in part because Abraham and God were so closely knit that God says, you know what? Because of Abraham, that gives me even more reason to go pull Lot out of this position that he's in. When you start chapter 19 following that conversation, that God and Abraham have had this intense, intimate conversation about Sodom and Gomorrah, you can't get to chapter 19 without understanding the way that conversation took place. That God looked at Sodom and Gomorrah, and the only way I could sort of make it add up is thinking along the lines of a business owner who has received call after call about a particular spot in his business. And they say, man, it's awful. Every time I turn around, there's something else going wrong in this particular spot. And the business owner says, well, I could fire him. I could just fire him. But I tell you what, to make sure everybody knows that this is as just and fair as possible, I'll go there myself. I'll stand beside them and I'll observe their work, and then I'll make my decision for sure. That's the only way I could sort of, and it's certainly at a deeper level than that with this, but it's similar in the sense that God says, I've heard so much about Sodom and Gomorrah, and I know what they are, but before I do what I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure that everybody understands I gave ample opportunity for every person in those towns to do what is right.
You talk about beyond the building right there too. I mean, you think about how in a city of 250,000 people, they'll say, about Sodom. A big city. It boils down to the fact that the bottom line is 10 righteous people would have saved the city. You think about the impact that righteous people have on a place. Like Proverbs 14:24, I think it is, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Or Proverbs 28:12 says, when the righteous triumph, there is great elation or happiness, but when the wicked rise to power, men go into hiding. And that's what happened in Sodom. Wicked men took control. They were in power. The righteous had gone into hiding, and whatever influence they had, it had just been completely overshadowed, I guess, by evil. And so there's a couple of lessons I need to know. Number one, the righteous people, they've got to be in the city. The only people that could save Sodom were the righteous people. Second, the righteous people have to be righteous.
Yes.
I mean, they got to be righteous. It's not just that they have to be there, but they actually have to be righteous. And then they got to stand up. They got to speak out. They've got to be able to not just live out their own righteousness, but do that and make their presence known in the lives of the people around them. And that would have been the difference in the salvation of the city. And so to me, it seems like there's a little bit of a beyond the building application right there in just this point we've been making, that God was merciful enough to say, hey, if they're there, I'll save them. No doubt. I'll give you that option. But that means on our behalf, the righteous have to be the righteous. The righteous have to be the righteous.
And what's interesting to me in the first part of chapter 19, to your point, Lot is in the city.
Yeah.
And he's sitting at the gate. Mm-hmm. And when they walk in the city, when these angels show up in Sodom, he immediately tries to dissuade them from going to the town square.
Yeah.
Please don't go there. Because, again, to reference the only other passage that we really have New Testament-wise is 2 Peter 2 about Lot. And it seems like sort of a cast-off line, but when you're talking about what we're talking about, it makes
perfect sense.
Makes a perfect sense and makes a perfect point that he was tormented daily by the things that he was paying, that he was seeing. And when these men show up, that's the lot that comes out is, I'm living here, I'm doing the best I can to be righteous, but I'm here to tell you that this place is full of sin. Yeah. And you do not want to go to the town square. And then to Ty's point, he's in the city, he knows what's happening in the city, and he tells these two men who he believes, when he sees them, he doesn't know that they're angels immediately, but he believes them to be good people.
My lords.
He's trying, he knows that they're not from Sodom and Gomorrah. He knows that. So he says, why don't you come and stay at my house? Well, why?
So I can protect them.
Because that's the only place you're going to find righteousness, man, is my house.
Right.
And then, of course, we know it's a very uncomfortable passage. It's just so uncomfortable. What happens, their attempt to break down the door of Lot's house to, for lack of a better term, I mean, it is what it is, to sexually assault these two visitors.
Right.
Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Think about how evil a city has to be for two visitors to your city to show up, and the men of the town are determined to sexually assault them their first night staying in your city.
Ugh.
To think about how evil, how purely evil you have to be for that to be the initial first thought, to the point that in verse 8, Lot even says, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Yeah. Let me bring them to you.
Yeah,
That's, I mean, it's to that level. And then you get to, and we won't spend any time on that because that's not really the aim for this particular discussion, but when you get to the end of verse 11, there is a miraculous occasion where all those men are struck blind. They're not able to find the door, and basically they wore themselves out. That's what the English Standard Version says, groping for the door. So they basically pass out. So imagine the terror of trying to go to bed that night, and you've got people scraping and beating on the side of your wall, trying to get in your house to sexually assault these two visitors all night long, till finally they wear themselves out. And if you're Lot, when you come to realize that the day of reckoning is happening, because that's what's next, right? Verse 15, as morning dawned, the angel said, up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of this city. Look at verse 16. But he lingered. That to me was the phrase that when I was thinking the God I thought I knew or beyond the building, either one of those two phrases. I think that applies to so many people. Is God provides this way of restoration or this way of salvation. And our initial response, our gut response is, but that means I've got to give up all of this, which I'm not real sure I want to do. And there's that lingered. And if you notice, God could have just as easily had those angels say, well, if you're going to linger, then we're out.
Right.
And that's not what God does. Look at what happens. They seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, and notice the phrase, the Lord being merciful to him.
Just like Ty said.
It's that's the point that you want to get to with the restorative nature of God is even in the midst of what is about to happen, you still have God seeking to be merciful, seeking to restore, seeking to clean up, seeking to pull out those that are righteous. I mean, that's what he's trying to do, even though Lot lingered. Now, why in the world would Lot linger? If he knows everything that's going on, he's sitting at that gate, tormented daily by what's going on, why is he lingering?
Yeah. It's like, to me, it's like, obviously there's a unique perspective that God has on all, on every situation. And God could see for Lot what Lot couldn't see. And I thought about that back in chapter 18, and you didn't mention this, but in 18 and verse 17, the Lord says, shall I hide? And he's talking to these men. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Mm-hmm. And then he goes on and talks about the promises that he makes to Abraham and obviously how he had entrusted him to carry out this covenant that he was making with his people. And then verse 20, the Lord said to Abraham, I'm telling you. And so it's like the Lord is thinking about Abraham's best interest. Mm-hmm. And then he makes a sovereign decision, obviously, to have that discussion with Abraham. But still, it was like, I care about Abraham so much. I'm going to do what's best for Abraham. And sometimes we think that God is just so distant, that God is not in touch with his creation, that he doesn't care about what's happening. But it's like, no, in this moment, when Lot was at his worst, when it seemed like God could have been detached, often when we feel that way, God was saying, no, I'll come get you, because I know what you don't. I can see what you can. That's right. I can see what you can't.
And talk about the God we thought we knew versus the God that's revealing himself in Genesis. I went back and looked at how God came down into the garden. He came down with Cain and Abel. He came down to witness the people building the tower in Babel. He came down to Abram 3 times, 12, 15, and 18. Yeah. And then in Sodom and Gomorrah, guess what he did?
The same thing.
He came down. And right. All of that precedes and shows us his nature. It precedes Jesus. In John 1, he came down. Philippians 2, he left heaven and came down to earth. So like you mentioned it, God feels distant and far off because that's the God you thought you knew. But the God that's revealed in Scripture over and over and over is a God who comes down to us.
And it has an effect on how you live your life. If you believe God is the wind-up toy, he's wound up the earth and pushed it out there and he doesn't really have anything to do with it,
right?
Then when things go bad, it's very easy for you to say, well, God doesn't care. Mm-hmm. God doesn't care. Well, how much worse could things be than right here? You've got a horrific situation. 250,000 people approximately, maybe, give or take a few thousand. And there's one righteous guy with a wife who obviously we know now is not as righteous as we had assumed, perhaps. 2 daughters who they're going to have their mistakes afterwards. Mm-hmm. You got one righteous guy standing in the midst of 250,000. Wouldn't it be simple for God just to wipe everybody out? Wouldn't it? I mean, that would just be easier. And God says, no, I'm going to send 2 angels down there. I know what it's like down there, but just so everyone understands that I'm acting justly, I am giving them full opportunity to return. And in some cases, not return, but to come to know God in the first place. Because apparently some of them had never known God in the first place.
Right. I've also overlooked this completely in Genesis 19. When they brought Lot, his sons, daughters, and family out of the city, Lot, and then they said in verse 17, don't look back, stop anywhere in the valley, escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Lot responded, oh no, my lords. Your servant has found favor in your sight. You've shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I can't escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, the city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Can I escape there? It's a little one, right? And if I escape there, then my life will be saved. And then verse 21, he said to him, and I'm assuming that's the Lord's, quote unquote. He said to him, behold, I grant you this favor also.
Also.
So it's like mercy, grace, favor. Even when Lot clearly showed a desire to linger, which made me think about the New Testament scripture of my citizenship is not here, but it's in heaven. Like, we all live with this juxtaposition of, I'm drawn to this earth and the things of it. I know my citizenship is in heaven, but I have moments where I want to linger. And then sometimes I even make deals with God. Like, I'll do this and I'll orient my life to you here, but can I keep that?
Right.
And I just see the grace and favor of God again, which I had not seen before.
Well, and then the interesting thing is, to wrap up here, so when you get into that 21, I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken, escape there quickly, I can do nothing until you arrive there. Okay, keep that in the back of your mind and quickly go to verse 26, the verse that we're familiar with, where Lot's wife looked around.
Right.
It's interesting to me that they say, we're not going to do anything until you get to Zoar. Once you get to Zoar, then we're going to unleash this destruction. And it says, verse 26, but Lot's wife, and then it adds, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. The two phrases, behind him and looked back, are hand in hand, meaning that Lot had done exactly what he said he would do. He went into Zoar. He was going to stay in that city to escape this destruction, and she didn't. She's behind him. Now, how far is she behind him? I don't know. But for her to be behind him means he's entering the city, and she's not. And she turns and looks, and that look is not a glance. That look is not did I hear something? Let me look over my shoulder. That is she turned around and looked at Sodom and Gomorrah and wanted to go back.
Yeah, it's a lingering with longing.
I want to go back.
Yeah.
And that is why she was turned into salt. So it doesn't make God mean. It doesn't make God angry. It means God said, do this so that you'll be saved, and she didn't.
That's right.
And that's the bottom line there. So here it is. This is the wrap-up statement, 29. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham. So take this all the way back to 18. God remembered Abraham. Take it all the way back to 13. God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. So then you go to 2 Peter chapter 2, and here's the phrase that's said by Peter. Beginning in verse 4, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Listen to this, verse 9. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. You cannot get around what verse 9 says at the beginning, and that's the encouragement I want to leave you with today. If God can go into Sodom and Gomorrah and it's pure evil, if God can deal with the ancient world and it's pure evil from Genesis chapter 6, every thought of every man's heart was pure evil. If God can go into those scenarios and those situations and he can restore the righteous and he can save the righteous, he can still do that today. So wherever you are, whatever you might be feeling like you're locked under, God can still come and save you, and he will. And he will. And that's the lesson I think you take from this experience of Lot's life in Genesis 19.
Thank you for joining. We'll catch you again next week on the Beyond the Building podcast.